To give you some statistics about cancer care teams, there was a study that was published last year, the Williams and Thompson study, which analyzed 179 studies and 56,187 cancer patients, found a uniform reduction in mortality rates for people who were part of being treated by a team versus an individual.
Are you curious about discovering ways of making your life better? Then welcome to my podcast. I'm Bob Nickman, and this is The Exploding Human. Listen in while I talk with all kinds of people in the fields of personal growth, health and healing, alternative therapies, psychology, spirituality, environment, and the future. I'm looking for those answers that make life better for everyone. You'll meet cutting-edge practitioners, doctors, artists, filmmakers, business people, and those who have overcome challenges, the brave, the curious, anyone who is out there helping us humans to explore, expand, and explode.
Hey, welcome to The Exploding Human. My name is Bob Nickman. Today my guest is Glenn Sturm, and we're going to be talking about the power of a cancer care team. Glenn is a 17-year cancer survivor whose journey began the moment he heard that he had incurable cancer, and how he drew on his experience from the military and from business to put together a cancer care team that involved much more than just a lead cancer doctor. Among other disciplines, Glenn utilized massage therapy, physical therapy, acupuncture, meditation. And he's going to be talking about the synergistic effect of using a care team and the incredible success of these teams around the world. So let's jump in. This is Glenn Sturm. Glenn, good morning. I'm so glad you're here. We had a nice little talk before we started recording, and we're going to get into your story and your new book. So let's tell your story first, and at least your some of your background in the military, and and then your cancer diagnosis and how you've worked with that over the last, I think it was 17 years I saw in your bio.
Yeah, well, we're starting the 18th year of treatment now. So, but I'm an Army brat. My dad was a career Army officer, and growing up, I went to 12 different schools from K through 12 because Dad was always being relocated. He was a great guy, and I desperately miss both my mom and my dad. They're two extraordinary people. But so at the end of high school, I had something happen, and this is kind of one of the pertinent things about what's happened in my life. Is I went to my fourth high school for my senior year. My dad had just retired, and so I was in the new school for 2 weeks, and we had a parent-teacher conference. Well, the teacher seen me for probably, I've been in her class for probably 10 hours total over those 2 weeks. So she starts out by telling my parents and me that I shouldn't go to college. I should probably go to trade school. And my mom looked at my dad and then looked at me and said, like, who is this person? Well, about 2 weeks after that, I'm going, there was no doubt I was going to go to college. It was an assumption. But 2 weeks after that, in Florida, they had a test back then. It was called a Florida Senior Placement Test. It was like the SAT for the state. And the teachers all started looking at each other that day and looking at me like, what did I do today? I mean, I don't like having notoriety. I just kind of tried to be invisible. But they all were looking at me. Well, the next morning on the public address system, the principal announced that for the first time in the school's history, one of our students had a perfect score on the Florida Senior Placement Test. And I was in the teacher's classroom who had said I shouldn't go to college, to go to trade school. When he announced my name, that I'm the first person in the school's history to ever get a perfect score. So, it was like such a poetic thing. But it gets to something my dad always taught me. He taught me two things. He taught me a lot of things, but these two are pertinent now. First thing is Sturms never quit. No matter what, you don't know how. Mm-hmm. You don't quit. Doesn't matter what it is. You never, ever quit. And so it got to the point that I didn't know how to quit. Even when I should have quit, I didn't know how. And we'll talk about later, hopefully, about the other side of that. But Sturm's never quit. And the other thing is only you can stop you. Well, I'd had a teacher who tried to stop me. And it gets better because after my first semester in college, actually it was quarters in those days, I was back in my small town in Florida, which is now a big town. But I bumped into her. I was on a date, and her and her husband were coming out of a movie theater. And she just kind of looked at me. And the University of Florida was the academic school in Florida then. I still think it is, but because of the national rankings. But it was then. And so she kind of looks at me like, well, how did school go? And I said, well, man, I got a question for you. Did you ever have a 4.0 in college? And she just looked at me. I said, well, I'm just curious, did you? So, well, yeah, you went to a teacher school, so you probably did. And I said, were you ever ranked number one in your class? And I said, guess what, ma'am? I am. I was both of those things. And being number one in the freshman class, I mean, it was just one of those things. It was such a poetically appropriate thing to do. I said, ma'am, quit judging people. Your job is to encourage people and to teach people.
Right.
Quit judging them and telling them what they can't do. Obviously, you weren't very good at judging about me, but you probably haven't been good at judging about a lot of people. Please don't do that. And her husband's standing right there next to me. He's just kind of looking at her like, what did you do? But at least he had enough discretion to not pound me, which he probably could have back in those days. But so the point is when I went to college, that happened. But the other thing that happened, which was prophetic my senior year in high school, I had a draft lottery number because that was one of the last years of the draft. And my draft lottery number was 33. That means I'm going to get drafted if I can't figure a way out. And the deferments were basically gone for college. And so I was offered an ROTC scholarship, which was going to pay all my tuition, my books, all my fees. And, basically college was going to be free. Well, I didn't really want to do that, but I really didn't have a choice. So my choice was either take the ROTC scholarship and have a 4-year obligation after college as an officer, or be drafted and become a private in Vietnam. Well,
what was that, like 1972?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so
I
took
think
my
we're
ROTC.
probably the same age because that's when I graduated high school.
Yeah. And so I took my ROTC scholarship and went, and then I've had all this problem my whole life, but trying to do too much at the same time. So I was very active on the campus and had a job doing sales, making good commission, and in a fraternity and all these other things. I had a great college experience. I have a lot to thank the University of Florida for. So at the end of college, I'm going to go in the Army. So it was hard to maintain the level of motivation that you would have otherwise, but I was still pretty motivated. But we had to take for ROTC scholarship students, you had to take like it was the GRE, I think, or something like that. And that test was to determine whether you qualified for a fellowship. Well, lo and behold, I did. So the Army paid for my undergraduate, and then they paid for my master's degree. And what a good deal was that? They flew me from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to Pepperdine in Malibu every other weekend for 18 months. So I'm a company commander in the Army in a line unit as a second lieutenant, and I'm flying to California, and I was single. I mean, it was not a bad environment. It was just like, how blessed could you be? And so my military career goes on, and what happened was it turned out that I really loved the military, and I loved commanding. I love the aspect of servant leadership that a good commander understands. And so my 4 years is up, we're coming up, and I had done very well, and I wanted to stay in, but I only wanted to stay in if I could command. And the Army, in its ultimate wisdom, said, you can't command. You've got 3 years of command as a lieutenant. That's more than people get as a captain. So you're going to have to wait till you're a major to command again. So that ended my military career on active duty. So I got out, went to work for a major med-surg supply company. It was the largest in the world. And in 2 years, I got 4 promotions, which required 3 physical relocations. And the next relocation was going to be to Chicago, and I really didn't want to move to Chicago that year. So I had been accepted at law school, and I went back to law school and ended up doing real well. Finished in the top 3 people in my class of 400. And so I had all the opportunities I could ever want. And these were all laying the predicates of the success that I had. And I made partner 2 to 2.5 years out of law school, which is normally 7 years. I was the corporate chairman of the firm 5 years out of law school. And that means I ran the corporate side of the firm, not the whole firm. I was on the executive committee for the whole time I was at the firm. And I stayed there for almost 20 years. And then there were a lot of things that happened. And I started the first internet banking software company. We took it public in 1999. I was the CEO because I'd done a lot of investing, but I had to be the CEO once, where I had no credibility because you have to actually be able to run something before other operators will listen to you. Now it's January 21st, 2009. Things are going great. I'm on my way to the University of North Carolina to give a speech, and I'm at the Atlanta airport at gate B13. Well, in those days, I ran marathons, did triathlons, and did most of those with doctors. I didn't, in those days, you didn't have all the spam calls that we have now. I didn't really recognize the number. It kind of looked familiar, but I didn't know what it was. In those days, you actually memorized phone numbers sometimes. But I answered it, and it was one of the doctors who we did triathlons with. And she said, Glenn, we got the biopsy results back. And I said, this is January 21st. I said, what biopsy? She said, well, we did them in December, right before your birthday. And I said, that was like 7 weeks ago. She said, yeah, we got the results back. And I said, well, okay, well, they've been doing biopsies on me for a decade. And she said, they came back positive for cancer. You've got lymphoma. I never knew why they were doing the biopsies. They just said they wanted to do it, so I let them do it. It can't hurt. And I thought, it was just like being struck by lightning. Then I thought about it for a few seconds. I said, okay, which one of those jerk doctor friends of mine put her up to this? And this is not a funny joke. So I said, okay, who put you up to this? She said, what are you talking about? I said, come on, stop it. This is a joke. And she gets this total change in her voice. She says, Glenn, now this is serious. You've got an aggressive cancer. And I need you back here today for more biopsies. I said, I'm at the airport going to give a speech. I can't cancel it. She said, well, you need to be here back tomorrow afternoon. So I was back the next day. Lo and behold, they confirmed the diagnosis. A friend of mine was able to get me to see Dr. Foss at Yale, who's the world's expert in the cancer that I have. I went to see her, and I come in. She's looked at the images and stuff, and she said, well, Glenn, she looked at me and she said, Glenn, you've got an aggressive incurable cancer, and we're putting you on chemo today. So I started that day oral chemo. That year, the oral chemo did okay, but not great, and the cancer continued to progress. And so in November, she tells me, we're going to have to put you on IV chemo starting the first of the year. And it's 3 days of IV chemo every 3 weeks here at Yale. Well, at the time I lived in Atlanta, I had a house in Wyoming, and my son was going to school out here now at that point, and I was commuting back and forth. And I'm sitting here saying, okay, well, the firm then had notified the insurance company. I was doing multi-billion-dollar deals and, running a team of lawyers on these transactions. And the insurance company said, there's something called chemo brain. We're scared to death he'll get chemo brain and miss something. So he needs to retire. So I was 54 years old, peak of the career, and struck by lightning, got cancer. And then you've talked about the rule of threes. So then my dog died shortly thereafter that. My mentor for my professional career, who my son is named after, died. And then I got served with divorce papers. It was probably the most fortuitous thing ever because my general practitioner said, Glenn, you need to see a psychiatrist with all these things going on. You're losing your job, all this other stuff. You need to talk to somebody. She was the first part of my cancer care team. and which is something that I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't know a whole lot about it now. I'd had a bike wreck shortly thereafter doing a race. It's called Latoja, and it's a one day 203 or 208 mile race with 8,000 or sometimes they say 7,000 feet of climbing. And the year before, our team had finished fifth. And that year I was determined to do a lot better, but we were seeded. And I had a really bad bike accident. And so there are two parts of that. So the first part was I was unconscious for 45 minutes, had a hemothorax, crushed collarbone, and they didn't do any testing. So I had chemo the following Monday morning at Yale. And so I flew on Sunday from Wyoming to Yale. And my doc starts asking me questions like, why is your arm in a sling? And a few other things. He said, Glenn, do you have the imaging from that bike wreck? I said, they didn't do any imaging. She coded me. And it turned out that I'd had an ischemic watershed stroke because my blood pressure had gotten so low when I was unconscious. And so, you know, I've now got my psychiatrist who's helped me in some stuff. I've got my great oncologist, and then I have to have physical therapy. And my doctor at Yale persuaded the insurance companies that I needed a lot of physical therapy. So I had 5-day-a-week physical therapy one-on-one for almost 10 years. And that person was the third member of my team. Well, the reason I said that I put all these pieces together this way is my middle daughter, one day went with me for my cancer treatment and asked my doc, not when I was there, how long I had for my diagnosis. She said, it's probably 2.5 years. And I didn't know that until about 18 months ago. How could it be 2.5 years and me still be in treatment 18 years later? I unknowingly put a team together. Well, in the medical field, they weren't used to teams in the United States at that time. Although in Australia and in Europe, they had started developing multidisciplinary cancer care teams about that time, in the early 2000s, and some people say in the late 90s. You know, the question for me now is the reason I have survived so well because of that. But to give you an example of how that works is if you know anybody with cancer, the most common side effect is something called cancer fatigue syndrome. These are fancy words. Basically, you're tired all the time. And if it's bad, you might go into, a point where you start falling asleep all the time. Well, when I went on IV chemo, that started happening to me. So I went to my psychiatrist about it, and I said, I don't know what to do because I fall asleep in the middle of the day. And I've been taking naps, but that really doesn't work. So she started, checking me out, and they diagnosed me with narcolepsy, which basically means, uncontrollable sleep at times. And so they put me on a medicine for that. Well, those fatigue issues went away. And then everybody used to call me Taz because I was like, always bouncing around with the attention span of an adolescent fruit fly. Mm. And, so I said, well, I'm also having problems concentrating on stuff. So I did some analysis and a bunch of tests and stuff. And I said, when do you have ADD? They gave me an ADD med. So the psychiatrist, who's my second principal doctor, took care of cancer fatigue syndrome and chemo brain, CTCRI, which is, chemo brain. There was a study just published about long-term cancer survivors and what do they have in common. And it's one of the first times they've ever studied the survivors. They study sick people all the time. But why do some people have this long-term survival? The most common thing they found is that they have a high quality of life. Well, if you're falling asleep all the time, if you've got nausea all the time, if you can't concentrate on things and you can't do the stuff you used to do, your quality of life hadn't been very good. In my case, I was still running marathons. I was still doing all these things. And I had re-engaged with my photography habits and started loving that. And the quality of life hadn't really changed other than the fact that I have to take chemo all the time. The one side effect that happened that was really evident quite away was nausea, and one of the nurses fixed that by giving me ginger, these ginger cheese, instead of having to take meds for it. So that's a large part of it, but that's the only part of it. But to give you some statistics about cancer care teams, there was a study that was published last year, the Williams and Thompson study, which analyzed 179 studies and 56,187 cancer patients, found a uniform reduction in mortality rates for people who were part of being treated by a team versus an individual.
In a sense, it's community,
Absolutely.
even though it's a a medical care team, it's still a community that is interested in you, in the person who's getting this team. They're feeling. I would think, whether they intellectually even realize it, they're feeling cared about and connected to something more than just, I'm sick. It's a whole, there's hope built into that formula right away.
There's something called a navigator or a guide. A lot of times it's a nurse or a nurse practitioner. Well, their job is to make sure, that you're getting all the treatment you need and that they've addressed all your side effects and stuff. Okay, the patient navigator, the nurse navigator. I was my own navigator, and I'll give you an example of that. There are 3 examples of it. But if you have one of those, it changes everything. Well, in the team that I've put together, which is probably the most comprehensive group, it's probably overly comprehensive, but I can explain it to everybody, all the reasons for all the people. And I'm getting ready to publish a book on this, because with cancer care teams, the mortality rate has gone down a minimum of 14% and as much as 90% for cancers. And the average, they're saying, is 70% reduction in mortality rates.
That's huge.
And wouldn't you think that would be in the newspapers?
Well, not around here in the U.S., but somewhere.
No. Well, just to give you an example on this multidimensional team, in Germany, there's what's called a silo practice, which means there's an oncologist or a doctor who makes the decisions. And then there's the team approach, which means you build a consensus. And the consensus, how does that work? Well, in Germany, the consensus, the team's recommendation, is what the doctors must follow. It's statutory, because that's how important it is. Well, in the States, we haven't done that. But to give you an example, so the first thing that was a big eye-opening experience was a bike wreck. Well, I had cancer, and my doc said, "Glenn, why didn't they do a MRI on you or something? Why didn't they call me?" Well, I wear a road ID, and it's got all my medical history, all the meds I'm on, and they didn't even look at it. And they dismissed me and let me go home. Well, out here, you may have to have an arrow in your throat before they really treat you. This is the cowboy world, and I mean that complimentary. They're a bunch of tough people out here, but they should have called. Well, the failure to call then, this was in 2009. About 4 years into it, they started noticing my AST and ALT levels were doubling every 3 weeks. That's your liver enzymes. And after this went on for a while, I had to see a liver oncologist, and she started trying to figure out what the problem was. Well, she couldn't figure it out. She saw no reason why that should be happening. She then brought in the folks from Oxford in England, who's the guy there was at the time the best doctor in the world for it. He couldn't figure it out. So I'm sitting here saying, okay, I got to figure this out, because they say I'm on the liver transplant list now, but they're not going to give a transplant to me over somebody who's otherwise healthy or who has, small kids or whatever.
Yeah.
So I better find out what causes. So I went back and looked for the previous 2 years, tried to identify every variable in my life, from stress-induced things to changing workouts to everything. And then I ran something called correlation coefficients to see if there was any correlation between the two variables. And then I didn't see anything initially. I added a delay factor in, like something 30 days or 60 days after a change. And lo and behold, there was a correlation coefficient of 0.96, which means there's 96% correlation between this one item and the liver failure issues. So I go back, I think I'm the smartest person in the world, and tell the doctors about it. They all look at me with great disappointment in their voices. Well, Glenn, correlation doesn't mean causation. I said 0.96. I said, no. I said, well, look, we're going to find out about causation. I'm not going to take that drug you put me on. You replaced Aleve with that drug to address a pain issue. Aleve worked fine. I'm going back to Aleve. So I went back to Aleve. After 3 weeks, my liver enzymes had stopped growing. After 6 weeks, the next time I was there, they had started going down. After 9 weeks, my liver enzymes were back to normal. We now have causation, and we now have, correlation and causation. So now we got to do a report to the folks about that drug and the side effect that I incurred because of the drug interaction issues. Well, that happened 2 more times for me. One was a detached retinas in my left eye and a torn retina in my right. Repaired it 3 months later, detached again. Ended up detaching 5 times before we found out it was a change in chemo agents that had caused it. Who's looking at these things from a scientific standpoint? Well, in my team that I put together, that a bunch of doctors have now looked at, and they always ask, why is there a neurologist here? And I said, because I don't know any other doctors who uniformly can do math. I'm joking when I say that, because there are lots of doctors who can do math. But the neurologists, everyone I've ever met, can do correlation coefficients and really complicated math functions. So they can do the work on identifying drug interaction problems. And that's actually happened to me once because of a very bad drug interaction problem. Let's just call it a severe allergic reaction. I almost didn't make it. And the neurologist was the one who figured it out.
Let me just ask you this. Are the drugs, when you say drug interaction, there's the drug interaction with the body, and then there's the drug interaction with other drugs.
Correct.
How do you sort of figure out which is which? Because, it's like this drug might work, but not in conjunction with this other drug.
Well, that's what you got to figure out. And you look for the delta, the changes based on changes in the drugs. I mean, I think I've got 30 or 31 prescriptions. Most of those drugs, it's like the drugs for cancer fatigue syndrome, neuropathy, and those things, narcolepsy, excuse me. Those have been there for 17 years and nothing bad's happened.
Yeah.
Well, when something bad happens,
you can look at the new thing.
You look at the new things, but you need to look at everything. But guess what? They're also the databases that are out there that'll tell you where there are known drug interaction issues. The pharmacist should do it, but the pharmacist that knows me, who has 3 times prevented me from getting a new drug because they know my resting pulse rate's around 50. One time they were want to do some cardiac tests, and they gave me a drug to take my pulse rate down because it needed to be lower than 70. And the pharmacist looked at it and said, Glenn, your heart's going to stop. Your resting pulse rate's 50. What was the doctor thinking? Did they look at your average pulse rate? Well, they're all busy, right? And, do they study everything every time? The answer is no. The good ones actually know you and will know those things, but the pharmacist sometimes knows you. So on my team, the pharmacist needs to be part of it. Another part of it is why did it work so well for me, my little team? Well, the physical therapists, exercise physiologists who work for me daily for 10 years, my cancer shows itself on the skin sometimes. And whenever it showed on my back, she took a picture and sent it to my doc at Yale. So every week she'd send a little report in. It might just be 3 sentences or 2 sentences or a picture with some stuff. But every week, my principal oncologist knew what was going on. That's what a team does for you. But for a team to be effective, it's got to have close to perfect communication. I think my team's really 6 people. My favorite people that are on the teams that everybody says need to be on the teams are like a chaplain, a music therapist, a yoga and meditation therapist, oncology, massage, acupuncture. Those are parts of the team. Well, you take one of those people, in my case, it was a physical therapist, who was an exercise physiologist. but was communicating my conditions and how I was doing overall to my principal doctor on a weekly basis. And that's what they're supposed to do now. Well, the people today, there's administrators for these teams. And you've got a multidisciplinary team coordinator. I mean, there are actually job descriptions for these people in other parts of the world and now in the United States. There's a clinical trials coordinator and a research nurse for your team. And then there's a tumor registrar who keeps track of your cancer and the progression of it. And then you need an epidemiologist who is a researcher who looks at, the scientific aspects and investigates patterns, causes, and effects of diseases. If you have a team that they're looking at all these things and they see some difference in your blood work or something else that is noticed, they can, figure out what they should do next. But if nobody's actually analyzing those things on a quantitative basis, why aren't they? In lung cancer, if there's a team, there's a 40% reduction in the risk of death. The 5-year survival rates have gone from 23% to 33%. That's one of the smallest increases in survival rates. My survival rate, as I remember, I told you it was 2.5 years when I was diagnosed. It's now 30 years because of the multidisciplinary team. I'm just lucky that I had a background to put teams together.
I've never thought about this until today because I've never heard of it. It makes complete sense. I mean, what is the thing that stops it? Is just a lack of knowledge that how much it works? Is it money? Overworked doctors? It's probably a lot of all those things.
Well, it's some of everything, but I have no proof on what I'm going to talk about. Okay, I'll say this again, I have no proof. But I'm an insurance company's worst nightmare. Yeah, I was supposed to die in 2.5 years according to the actuarial tables, and it looks like now I may last 50. I won't, but I may last 50 years on chemo. Can you imagine the cost of that? So, they probably don't think it's a great idea. Well, then you've got the silo-based doctors, the ones who are just spectacular, who don't want a team telling them what to do. Okay, so there's something that used to be called tumor boards. And the tumor boards was an educational thing where the principal doctor would come in and say, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, to educate everybody else. Well, today in the multidisciplinary practice, no, that's not what happens. You've got a group of doctors and other professionals, including, social workers, genetic counselors, pharmacists, speech and language pathologists, physical therapists who are there or who may be there, who have a right to tell people what they think. And we're going to come down to the last piece of this puzzle in a second. And the doctors may not like that. And then the pharmaceutical companies. Again, I have no proof of any of this. How much would a pharmaceutical company be worth if they developed a drug that on average reduced all cancers by mortality by 70%?
Yeah, it'd be huge.
Yeah, it'd be hundreds of billions of dollars in value.
Yeah.
Well, if you do this process and you reduce those mortalities, how many new drugs do we really need? Well, that's how the pharmaceuticals make their money. So, there's 3 constituencies. You don't know if any of them are doing anything to stop it. And most of the doctors I know who and the researchers who work in pharmaceutical industries would probably shoot me for the inference I'm saying this might be going on. But it's, you got to ask questions. The last 100,000 foot level issue here is they have meetings of these teams. So they got the teams are called MDTs, multidisciplinary teams, and then you have MDMs, which is multidisciplinary meetings. Well, if you look at what's going on in those meetings, who should attend? It's all the people who do it. So I started working about who makes the decisions about your treatments, right? Who should have a say in it? Well, under the tumor board realm, and I've been in front of tumor board, my case has been in front of tumor boards. I've never been in front of one. In tumor boards, the patient's never there. And never is not the right word. I'm not aware of a patient being at a tumor board meeting. So then they asked the doctor, should the patient be present in the MDM meetings? In Europe, the answer is they should be encouraged to be present. Under NCI's rules, the patient should be encouraged to be there. But I'm not aware of a single case in the United States, and that's because my information is imperfect, of where people are being encouraged to attend. But the National Cancer Institute, NCI, says that you should be there. You should be encouraged. And there's a reason for it. Well, if you look at consents to procedures, one of the things that the doctor is supposed to review with you are your options to a surgery. I've had 55 surgeries now, but I'm having a very serious surgery because I had 100 perfs in my intestine. And I was pretty sick. And the anesthesiologist is, there, and he's going to wheel me in, and they've already put me on a sedative, and they pull the forms out for me to sign for informed consent. And by the way, if you've been taking a sedative, you can't really give informed consent.
Yeah, that's an odd order of operations there.
Well, only one hospital I can remember did it right, which is Maya, who the anesthesiologist interviewed me a week before the surgery and told me everything, and I signed this up then. But so in this case, this is a great anesthesiologist, and he's wheeling me into the OR because the anesthesiologists almost always are late because they're so busy. And I joked with him about this, informed consent really isn't informed. He said, well, whatever, we got to sign or you can't get this procedure done. We need to save your life. I said, okay. So as we're going in there, he said, Glenn, do you want to listen to any music? I didn't even ask you. I said, absolutely. He said, who do you want to listen to? I said, Jimi Hendrix. At this point, I'm in the OR, and they're going to move me over and stuff. And the nurses are there and the techs are there and everybody is there except for the principal surgeon. He said, well, Jimi Hendrix? I said, yeah. He said, what song? I said, Are You Experienced? Well, when I did that, every person in the room except for him breaks into laughter because it is a song, but they could tell I was cracking a joke. And think about it, though. Under the MDM rules, they should have told me what the options were to the surgery before they rolled me into the OR. Now, in that case, it was probably an emergency surgery, and it saved my life. So I'm not complaining about it. But when you're going to do certain types of treatments, like are you going to go on IV? If IV, which IV? Why those? Why isn't the patient involved? Why doesn't the patient have the understanding or given the chance to have the understanding of the options? Well, you really can't have informed consent unless you know that information, or at least you were offered that information. Well, some of the hospitals are calling it multidisciplinary tumor boards, which makes no sense because the difference in one is you've got a absolute decision maker, and the other thing you've got a consensus of a group of professionals, and the consensus group, there is no doubt, has a materially better results if you work with a team. I mean, it's really simple. In my new book on this topic, there's going to be QR codes in it, and one of the QR codes is here's a multidisciplinary team that I suggest you may have used. 20% of these people, you may use more. There's 3 introductions. One's for patients, one's for caregivers, and then one's for the institutions. And at the very end of the institutional one, there's two phrases. Question number 1 is a question. The question is no longer whether integrated multidisciplinary care works. It does. So the question really is whether your institution is providing this service. If it isn't providing this service at the highest quality levels, how are you going to fix this problem? If you can't fix the problem, where should you be sending your patients? Okay, because when you have a 70% reduction in mortality, that's not saying a 70% survival rate, but a reduction in mortality. I mean, don't you think everybody wants to know that?
Yeah, I would want to know that. I'm finding out today.
Yeah, and so I'm writing this. My first novel is finished. It's a book, one of a 6-book series. I finished it in October. And I started coming across all this information while that book was with the editors. And once I got to a certain level of it, I just dropped finishing that, and I'm writing this book to get it out as quickly as possible because people need to know about this. Now, in my hometown in Jackson, Wyoming, we have one oncologist. They do a good job here because they've got an acupuncturist and they've got, massage people, but they don't have the rest of these doctors you need. So who are they going to affiliate with is the question for the local place here. Otherwise, they're a silo, and silos under all the studies have no reduction in mortality rates.
So really, you're talking about having to advocate for yourself to an enormous degree to put the other advocates together.
Right. And so in the questionnaire for the individual, with the introduction, says the question is no longer whether the integrated multidisciplinary care work. It works, and the results are breathtaking. The real question is whether your institution is providing it. If it isn't, and you are a patient or caregiver, who will be your next institution or doctor be?
And then you have the insurance piece of,
Yep.
So that's always a complicated thing.
Of course it is. And the thing is, but they've been doing this in Europe and Australia for 2 decades, and it works.
Yeah. Let's say the name of your book before because we're right on that track here.
The first book is Cancer Set Me Free. The new is a second book in the series, but it's called More Than Hope: The Compelling Promise of Fully Integrated Multidisciplinary Cancer Care Teams. It's just More Than Hope, and it's under my name, and it'll be out in April.
I'm thinking about something as we're talking. This is a little off the technical side. That I'm thinking about the kind of person that you were before you got the diagnosis, and still are, but that you're, highly accomplished, very disciplined, very successful person who all of a sudden, the rug's pulled out from under you with this diagnosis. I think about what happens inside a person when that happens. It's like the whole sort of structure of how your life is gets removed in a sense. It gets rocked real hard. And some people would, just give up. Some people would be angry. And maybe you go through all these kinds of things because it's almost like you have to almost process all these feelings. Why me? It's not fair, which it isn't. And so what has changed in you? And we'll say mentally, spiritually, physically, we know in those areas, having received that diagnosis and then having this long-term success in your treatments with obviously a lot of road blocks going along that you had to overcome. And I'm sure you're still dealing with it, of course. So, but, what would you tell somebody what's the thing that's so important, the most important, the thing that you've realized, things or something that you've realized having gone from really the top of the mountain to kind of getting kicked down to the bottom and then climbing back up?
Well, the first thing that happened was when I was in that 3-week period before I'd had the diagnosis confirmed before I got to see the expert, I read everything I could find. And I'm a research hound. I just love reading and solving problems. But I came across this article from a gentleman who had died from my cancer. And he had lasted about 6 months from his diagnosis. And he wrote this shortly before he died. And he said in it how thankful he was for his 6 months. And I'm sitting here saying, are you kidding me? I'm 54, 6 months? And so you continue to read, and the guy said, I'm not like my friends who died in Vietnam. I'm not like my friends who died in a car wreck or died from a heart attack. I've had 6 months to make peace, try to make the world a better place for my family. That basically set the foundation for what I was going to do, because again, remember, my family motto is Sturm's never quit. And I said, okay, I'm not going to let cancer define me. I'm going to my chemo and cancer stay in New Haven, Connecticut. And when I'm not in New Haven, I don't have it.
Mm.
I mean, the photography started immediately. It became successful in 2017, which was like 8 years into it, when I started shooting eclipses. And, and from there, I had a blog the whole time about something called Carrying Bridge, because I didn't want to talk to people about my stuff, but everybody wanted to know. There's one important piece of advice for everybody, and that is when somebody asks you when you've got cancer or some other traumatic thing, how are you doing? How do you feel? That's not a question. That's a greeting. Because if you answer the question, they're going to run for the hills. And sometimes you have people that might be okay if they ran for the hills, because you really don't want to have to talk to them again about it. But if it's a greeting, you just say, I'm doing great. How are you? Okay. But, the minute you start answering that question, it makes everybody else nervous, because they may have your problem. You combine that with, you don't quit. So don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't quit. And the question is, what are you going to do now to make the world a better place?
Is there a website where people can go to find out more about you and what you're doing?
Yeah, well, yes, it's glennsturm.com, GLENNSTRM.com. If anybody sees anything I write that they don't agree with, please go to info@glennsturm.com and tell me what you think the mistake I've made. I really would appreciate that, because we all want to make it as perfect as possible.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. What a wonderful talk, and what a great gift to meet you today. Thank you so much, and also thank you for your service in every area of your life, from military to business to now health.
Well, no, thank you, and thank you for what you're doing. It's a great service to our country for what you're doing today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Have a great day, Glenn.
You do the same.
Much appreciation for you folks listening to The Exploding Human. The website is theexplodinghuman.com. You can also listen on YouTube. That is The Exploding Human with Bob Nickman. Once again, I want to thank Glenn Sturm for being on the show. If you want to find out more, go to glennsturm.com. Have a fantastic day. Thank you.